Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session 7 of the ASPG conference. My name is Andrew Young, and I'm going to moderate this session. By way of brief introduction, I am the Clerk of the Legislative Council and Clerk of the Parliaments at the Victorian Parliament. I've also previously served on the State Executive of the ASPG, and at the outset, I'd like to congratulate the current and outgoing executive members for their perseverance and hard work to make this conference happen after 2 very challenging years of COVID disruption. So as many of you know, the conference theme is Parliamentary Transparency, Checks and Balances. And the topic of this session, number 7, is Checks and Balances. I'm shortly going to introduce our 2 presenters, who will each speak for approximately 20 minutes, allowing about 20 minutes for questions and discussion at the end, which I'll moderate, and I'll ask that you use the raised hand function if you wish to ask a question when we get to the Q&A part of the session. And a reminder that this session is due to conclude by 2 p.m. So our first presenter will be the Honourable Jonathan O'Dea, MP, Speaker of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. And Jonathan was elected Speaker of the New South Wales Assembly on the 7th of May 2019. And upon his election as Speaker, he spoke to the House foreshadowing a number of changes during his speakership to improve and modernise the Parliament. Jonathan was first elected as member for Davidson in 2007, following a career in the private sector. He holds bachelor's degrees in arts and law. He has a master's degree in law and business admin, and he's also a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And before entering politics, Jonathan initially worked in law and then in senior management roles. Jonathan previously served as a non-executive board director of a major health insurer, HCF, as well as on boards of education, government and charity organisations. His previous parliamentary roles include Chair of the New South Wales Public Accounts Committee, Parliamentary Secretary for Major Events and Tourism, Trade and Investment, and Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier and Treasurer. A little bit later, I'll introduce Colleen Lewis, our second speaker. But for now, I'll hand over to Jonathan. And Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And can I echo your sentiment in thanking the Victorian organisers? I know we've had a couple of false starts, and it'd be lovely to be meeting everyone in person. But it's great to see that the show does go on. Can I also just apologise if I'm looking a little bit red-eyed? It's because I've just arrived back from the United Kingdom this morning, but raring to go. And thank you for those of you who are joining us from all around Australia and elsewhere. The topic of my paper this afternoon, sorry, it's still morning in my head, early morning, but is around political donations reform and campaign financing. There's no doubt that modern democracies do require robust checks and balances in order to effectively operate in an age of widespread wariness and cynicism towards politicians and the legislative process. And citizens do rightly expect that their decisions that are made by governments and parliaments are free from undue influence. And so it is important that we have checks and balances around political donations reform and the way that we fund elections. And so I'm going to speak to that today. And there's no doubt that donations to political candidates and parties are fraught with dangers. And if the public does perceive that a politician can be bought and sold, then for the interests of a major donor and their own interests or policy agenda, then that perception undermines trust and confidence in our electoral system and the decision-making process to the detriment of democracy. It's therefore really important to seek improvements to the current donations framework. And I'm talking not just in New South Wales, where we do have a fairly restrictive and I think advanced political donations framework. I'm talking across the nation, across Australia, but I'll make particular reference to New South Wales, where I know we can improve even on what is relatively a reasonably good model. and certainly to minimise potential risks posed by private donations. And what I've proposed is an opt-out model of public funding, potentially full public funding, as something that would better serve candidates, parties, and constituents. Political donations have long been the subject of controversy in Australian political life. And I think we can all think of recent and not so recent examples. Last year, we saw Attorney General Christian Porter causing some outrage when he accepted donations from a blind trust. We've seen in New South Wales, former Labor General Secretaries Jamie Clements and Kayla Murnane, as well as Senator Sam Dastyari, fall foul of various investigations, including cash donations. And we've seen a range of other parties, some of them big business, heavyweights like Gina Rinehart, Andrew Forrest, Clive Palmer, number of large companies, all be called into question. And there have been dubious donation scandals that have caused a number of politicians to appear before ICAC in New South Wales or to fall upon their swords. But those living in a capitalist society with a market economy generally do accept the exchange of money for goods or services, or the presentation of a gift in appreciation of genuine service rendered. And if a person strongly believes or agrees with the beliefs, ideals, and actions of a particular political party or candidate and wants to make a modest monetary donation to signal that support, then generally the citizens of a liberal democracy would see that as reasonable. However, the problem with political donations is their actual or their perceived power to potentially purchase undue influence over a candidate or political party and the decisions that they make. And whether monetary sums and discounts or in-kind gifts such as travel, accommodation, and dining are on offer, the prevailing sentiment is that such situations, legally sanctioned or not, can lead to an unspoken quid pro quo arrangement. The candidate or the party can become subtly indebted to the donor, with the donor expecting a call in of the debt for a suitable favour at an appropriate time. So rather than primarily considering what's in the best interest of the public, the candidate or party may then feel obliged to fulfil what might be seen as their end of the bargain by swaying decisions towards donor interests over those in the general public. And indeed, in New South Wales at the moment, in the newspapers, there's reports of a local mayor who is called into question through donations in kind. Only in the last, in recent days, some of you may have picked that up. I've circulated, or rather I've sent a detailed paper, and I'm not going to speak to the whole paper, but suffice to say, there are significant pressures on political parties and political candidates to raise money for elections. So, and there is a need to run an election with financial and other resources. But how do we generate, or how do we create a system that keeps candidates and parties out of the mire? While there will always be those who want to curry favour through offers of political donations, I believe the way forward lies in improving and strengthening the existing legal framework. And if candidates and parties have access to legitimate sources of increased public funding, then there'll be less pressure to privately raise funds or tap more ethically questionable funding sources. There've been a number of attempts in New South Wales to go further than the current regime around donations, and I'll touch on some of the features of that in a moment. In particular, I just want to mention two attempts. One was in 2011, when the then new O'Farrell government amended the Electoral Funding Act and tried to restrict donations to only individuals on the electoral roll. Those changes also attempted to limit campaign expenditure undertaken by third parties. But unfortunately, then there was unfortunately from my perspective, there was a subsequent challenge to that, and that was undertaken by Unions New South Wales. And in that High Court case, that reform, which Barry O'Farrell as Premier had tried to implement, was found to be invalid, as it contradicted the implied principle of freedom of political communication within the Commonwealth Constitution. Then in 2014, there was an expert panel with eminent Australians, particularly politically balanced in New South Wales, and that attempted to look at issues of funding again. And unfortunately, again, the panel didn't result in substantial reform in terms of particularly the issue of an opt-in, opt-out system of full public funding as an alternative to a total ban of political donations. And that was despite Labor Party support for a full public funding model at that time. I've outlined in my paper the legal framework for donations in New South Wales, and I won't go into detail on that given time constraints, but suffice to say that it does involve a number of restrictions along the lines of donation reportable limits. Anything over $1,000 has to be reported in a financial year. It's unlawful to make or receive cash donations over $100. There are caps on political donations this year of about $6,700 for a political party, or $3,100 for the benefit of individual candidates. There are other limitations in terms of donations. There are categories of donation donors prohibited, for example, property developers, tobacco, liquor, gambling, and their close associates. So there are quite a number of restrictions, including a capped expenditure in any one electoral district or overall across various legislative assembly and legislative council contexts. So those sorts of controls don't, however, exist in all jurisdictions across Australia. For example, in the federal sphere, there are much higher limits in terms of donations. Then the transparency is not what it should be, and there aren't the same sorts of restrictions in terms of categories of donors. Again, I've gone in the paper, I go into a little bit more detail in terms of those donations in other jurisdictions, both with the federal government and other states, and there's an appendix for those who are interested in the detail in that respect. But what I wanted to do before I just outline some of the basic principles under which a full public or an opt-out public funding model might operate, I just wanted to touch base on a case study from the US, particularly campaign finance in US presidential elections. Because in the minds of many, the office of the President of the United States is the pinnacle of political power, and certainly governing one of the world's most established modern democracies. And the funding of candidates' presidential campaigns does make a worthwhile case study and offers some lessons in terms of implementing an opt-out or system or an opt-in system in the Australian context. In fact, in 1971, Congress passed a Federal Electoral Campaign Act to largely replace what was a dysfunctional and unenforceable federal campaign system, which capitalised in part on the Watergate scandal and associated groundswell of public support for political donations reform. At the time, donors were limited to contributing a maximum of $1,000 to a federal candidate per election, with a total biennial restriction of up to $25,000 for federal candidates and committees. There was public disclosure of contributions becoming mandatory, and expenditure caps on campaigns run by presidential and congressional candidates. Now, unfortunately, and again, the paper goes into greater detail, in a number of ways, that reform has been undermined, initially through a legislative and a court's decision, a Supreme Court decision, which invalidated the expenditure caps, and there were also with an opt-in system that was further undermined, first under Barack Obama, who opted out of the presidential public funding program, and subsequent presidents have now maintained that trend, and indeed we saw that recently in the most recent US elections. Furthermore, there's been a rise of super political action committees, or super PACs, which get around, I suppose, the political party funding system, and result in these so-called independent groups exerting significant influence over elections. And then there's also been a further dismantling of the public campaign finance framework through the decision of courts in other cases, again, as I outlined in the paper, and that's also ended public funding of political parties' presidential nomination conventions. So I'm not naive in saying that there aren't problems or issues that need to be carefully addressed in potentially introducing an opt-out public funding model. But in the paper, I outline 6 guiding principles, and I go into some detail on those 6 principles, but I'll just touch on the 6 very quickly. Firstly, any system has to be transparent. You need information about political donations to be made available in a timely manner and accessible to the public. Secondly, it has to be an honourable system where political candidates and parties should perform their roles with integrity and without the actual or perceived undue influence that private donations can create. Thirdly, it has to be a comprehensive system where donation laws are clearly understood, yet also sufficiently extensive and enforceable to efficiently regulate relevant activities. Fourthly, it has to be lawful. So any changes in election funding arrangements must comply with the law. We saw that, as I said, that problem, particularly with the Commonwealth Constitution, the way that the O'Farrell reform was put together. You can address that, I believe, through making it a voluntary opt-in, opt-out scheme. Fifthly, any scheme ideally should be consistent. You should have all the states and territories and the Commonwealth, ideally, with consistent donation laws across all jurisdictions. Otherwise, there are gaps and ways around. And lastly, it should be representative. So there should be a relevant donations framework broadly reflecting the public opinion and basically just passing the pub test. So it's representative of public opinion. As I said, the paper goes into detail on those 6 principles and gives a little bit more detail in terms of some of the proposed approaches to address potential concerns. So in conclusion, while New South Wales already does enjoy a fairly strict legal framework for political donations, there are shortfalls. And an opt-out public funding model where people can elect not to receive private political donations and thereby receive extra public funding is a concept which I think does warrant further consideration. As I said, having the opt-out model where people can elect to receive full public funding doesn't breach constitutional requirements in terms of freedom of speech, and because you're giving the choice to the potential recipient of the donation, not the donor, and not telling the donor they can't donate. But that concept and the fine-tuning of it, I've proposed, would be worthy of being put before a citizens' jury or a citizens' assembly, and also undertaking wider public consultation, because I believe it would prompt a more principled solution for New South Wales and other jurisdictions to better address the challenges and ultimately strengthen our democracy, thereby improving the system of checks and balances that are so important for the effective operation of our democracy and confidence in it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And look, at the outset, I think it adds great value to this conference that we've got a senior sitting member of a parliament willing to come on and actually talk about campaign funding, because many members probably would be hesitant to talk about that issue. So thank you very much for the presentation and the paper and bringing this topic to life. I'm sure you'll elicit some questions at the end of the session. I'll go on to the second speaker, and that is Colleen Lewis. And I should add, we'll save up all the questions to the end of the session. The second speaker is Colleen Lewis, and Colleen is the National President of the ASPG. So many of you may have met Colleen previously at this or previous conferences. Colleen has a long and distinguished academic career and is particularly sought out for her commentary on matters of public integrity. I don't have a formal bio for Colleen in front of me, but Colleen, please feel free to add to my modest introduction there. But for now, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think that introduction is wonderful and I appreciate it. I don't need to go on. I would just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional Aboriginal owners of the land upon which we are meeting today, and to pay my respects to their culture, the elders, past, present and future, and elders from other communities who may be here with us today. I'd also like to say that I'm delighted to be on the same platform as Speaker O'Day. I have always enjoyed his papers. He always tackles issues that a lot of MPs would not do in a public forum, as you just referred to, Andrew. And I've always enjoyed the conversations we've had after. So certainly is my pleasure to be on that platform with him. I'll start now with my presentation, and forgive me if I read more than I normally would, but I've been a little bit busy in the last few days and I was a late entrance into giving a paper. But look, as everyone listening to this presentation knows, there are fundamental differences in the structures and processes underpinning liberal democratic political systems and those of authoritarian regimes. In authoritarian dictatorships, decision-making is opaque and accountability is virtually non-existent. Leaders are protected from scrutiny, and any institutions that an authoritarian government claims can deliver accountability is often best described as bogus facades deliberately designed to protect rather than expose misconduct, including corruption in public life. In contrast, the systems and processes in liberal democratic political systems are supposedly designed to ensure open and transparent processes in the public sector, which include the establishment of independent institutions that have the budget and the powers required to ensure decision makers, and that's parliamentarians, their staff and appointed public servants, are held accountable for their actions. However, what is supposed to happen in theory and what does occur in practice sometimes differs and does so in a disturbing fashion. In some cases, the gap between theory and practice is too wide to be excused. One of the most worrying examples of what can only be described as an alarming gap between democratic theory and practice is found in the federal government's model for an anti-corruption body, which is titled the Commonwealth Integrity Commission. I'll refer to it sometimes as the CIC. The CIC's focus is on the public sector. To varying degrees, the supposedly independent commission's powers extend to all elected members of Parliament, the institution of government, those who work directly for MPs, that is their staff, and appointed public servants. In theory, the CIC is supposed to deliver effective accountability. In practice, it cannot. Well, not in relation to the vast majority of appointed and elected public servants. Before continuing to outline my criticisms of the CIC, I want to make it clear that my comments are in no way partisan. I would be making exactly the same comments if the Labour Party, Greens, an independent or a collection of independents had put forward and promoted the same or a similar model. The criticisms I make are based on my 25 plus years of research into public sector anti-corruption matters, and they're also based on those of experts in exactly the same field. And it gives me absolutely no pleasure to say that the CIC is a disturbing accountability policy. It is discriminatory. It casts a slur on all public entities that fall under its law enforcement division, which I'll refer to later, and has been meticulously designed to protect members of Parliament and their staff from open and transparent accountability. Now, I'm far from alone in making this harsh evaluation of the model. The CIC has been severely criticised by nearly every expert in the anti-corruption accountability field and many respected non-partisan institutions that exist to monitor and to try and ensure transparency and accountability in that broader public sector. It has been rejected by the opposition Labour Party, by the Greens, and by the Independents. The model is so concerning that it led to 34 former judges penning an open letter expressing their strong disquiet over the CIC. This is a rare happening indeed. Many of the criticisms were raised nearly immediately following the public release of the model in December 2018 by the former Attorney General, Christian Porter. I don't think it is exaggeration to say that the experts could not really believe that any Liberal Democratic government would promote such a policy. The public consultation process that commenced very shortly after the introduction of the Commonwealth Integrity Commission and continued over the following 2 to 3 years has been less than ideal. Having been personally involved in 3 of the consultation processes, the first in January 2019, I can say that the 3 I attended did leave a lot to be desired. During the January 2019 consultation process, those taking part expressed their deep concerns about the different powers granted to the 2 divisions that constitute the CIC. We were told that this aspect of the model was firm. In other words, it didn't matter what the experts said. The 2 divisions with their vastly different powers would remain. Why then are we having this public consultation process? Was the question posed to the senior public servants running it. Now, in terms of the model itself, the glaring inadequacies stem from the structure of the CIC. As mentioned, it is divided into 2 distinct divisions. They are the Law Enforcement Division and the Public Sector Division. A somewhat peculiar choice of title for the latter, as both divisions cover public servants, but I digress. The crucial point is that the CIC does not treat all public servants, elected and appointed, equally. Markedly different powers apply to each division. The unproven argument put forward by the government to justify its creation of two vastly different divisions is that a person with law enforcement powers is much more prone to corruption or to be tempted to be corrupt than those falling under the public sector division. I would like to see the research-based evidence that supports this claim. It seems to me that the split model casts a slur on all those public servants who sit under the law enforcement division. They include the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Taxation Office, and several other entities. Now, as time is limited, I'm only going to touch very briefly on some of the powers that apply to the 9 public sector entities that form the law enforcement division. And outlining them will help you when I get on to the public sector division to see the contrast. A member of the public is permitted to refer a matter if it relates to a law enforcement division matter directly to the CIC, and they can do that even anonymously. The CIC commissioner can exercise own motion powers to commence an investigation and can hold public hearings when the commissioner deems such hearings to be in the public interest. After an investigation is completed, the CIC commissioner must issue a public report, and that report must outline the commissioner's findings. It must include the evidence that supports those findings, any proposed actions or those already taken to address the corruption-related problem, and the report must make recommendations that the commissioner deems will address the conduct and prevent it from recurring. The commissioner can also state whether a staff member of the law enforcement division engaged in corrupt conduct. This division's powers are similar to most anti-corruption commissions, established to be effective forms of accountability and that have been empowered to act in the public interest. In stark contrast, however, the public sector division, especially in relation to parliamentarians and their staff, is denied these powers. The division is subject to little, if any, transparency and has been carefully, and I would suggest deliberately crafted to protect parliamentarians, their staff, and 80% of the public sector from public scrutiny. And I make these somewhat severe assessments for the following reasons. In the public sector division, no anonymous complaints are committed in relation to its members, nor can the head of a public sector department or unit refer a matter to the CIC for investigation. The ability to use own motion investigative powers are very narrowly circumscribed in relation to the public sector division. As Charles and Williams explain in their very recently published book, Keeping Them Honest, the CIC commissioner may only act if he or she, in the course of an investigation, is alerted to or reasonably suspects that the offence to which the newly discovered corruption matter has been or is in the process of being committed. And anybody wanting an in-depth analysis of the CIC, I highly recommend that book, Keeping Them Honest. Those in the public sector division are not only protected from complaints about corruption being made directly to the CIC, but such complaints have to be made to the head of the organisation to which the complaint refers. Two senior officials, namely the head of the relevant public sector department unit and the CIC commissioner, must confidently and reasonably suspect and agree that an offence has been committed. No public hearings are permitted in relation to anyone who falls under the public sector division. Now, how can such a restriction be seen as democratic? And is it not discriminatory against those in the law enforcement division? Reports in relation to investigations concerning the behaviour of a member of Parliament a staff member working for a parliamentarian or the office itself are deliberately hidden from the public gaze. But the restriction surrounding such reports gets worse. Reports are not allowed to express an opinion or make a finding or recommendation in relation to MPs, their staff members, or an MP's office. I can think of no other anti-corruption body in a functioning democracy that is so deficient when it comes to holding all elected and 80% of appointed public servants to account. The public sector division is not a check and balance on the exercise of power. Rather, it appears to be an obvious attempt to shield many in the public sector from public scrutiny. The public sector division of the CIC and the secrecy that accompanies the reporting of corruption-related issues by MPs, their staff and their officers would sit more comfortably in a political system headed by an authoritarian dictator and their cronies. It should never be part of an accountability regime in a country like Australia. While Australians complain and grumble about their politicians and other aspects of the political system, they still support strongly the democratic foundations of its political system. At the last election, the government promised the Australian people that if elected, it would establish a federal anti-corruption body. Prime Minister Morrison explained that reason he didn't do so was that the Labor Party is to blame, as it would not support a model in Parliament. This is a disingenuous attempt to justify Australia's continued lack of a federal anti-corruption body, but no member of Parliament, even vaguely concerned about transparency and accountability, would support the CIC model. So why then did the coalition stick by this discredited model? Perhaps as suggested by some experts in the anti-corruption field, the coalition is concerned about the consequences of establishing an effective CIC. Perhaps it does not believe in serving the public interest by exposing corruption-related conduct by those who exercise power on behalf of all Australian citizens. There is also the possibility that the coalition is not a strong believer in some of the key principles underpinning a liberal democratic political system, such as the principle that public office is a public trust and therefore requires that the public interest inform and is the foundation of all public policy. The CIC model does not do this. I would also, I really put forward another possible reason that I think some people listening today may think is rather far-fetched, but it's an issue that I have written about and one that I think may account for several of the problems that beset our parliamentary democracy. I'm talking about the need to have compulsory education programs for MPs that drill down on why it is important to the health of Australia's political system to respect and adhere to liberal democratic values. At the moment, an MP with the ability to set the legislative framework that guides all citizens' lives is not required to understand even a rudimentary level of the pillars that support our political system. I can think of no other profession that allows its members to operate in what could potentially be a knowledge vacuum. How would you feel about engaging a lawyer, consulting a doctor, or being cared for by a nurse who had only attended, say, a 4-day induction program? Indeed, would you employ a plumber, an electrician, or a builder that had not attended compulsory education and training programs before being allowed to fix your drains, attend to your electricity failures, or build your house? I stress that what I'm not suggesting is an education bar for candidates, as I strongly believe that every citizen, regardless of their background, should be able to stand for Parliament. Indeed, perhaps one of the greatest pities these days is that far too many MPs are professional politicians, and in the case of the Labour Party, are former union officials. Candidates from whatever party would need to know a lot about their party, what is required of them to become a candidate, and candidates are usually across party rules, but how many are familiar with the Australian Constitution, and how many have an in-depth knowledge of the political system? Older members of today's audience, such as me, may recall that two former premiers did not know what the separation of powers meant, and one of them had been a premier for many, many years. What I'm suggesting is that once elected to Parliament, all MPs should have to undertake continuous education programs, and those programs should be compulsory. Research shows the need to make such education and training programs compulsory, for despite the excellent programs devised and on offer by dedicated parliamentary officers and staff, attendance rates are extremely low. I know that MPs and their staff are busy people, but so too are members of many other professions and occupations, yet they must undertake continuous education programs to ensure that their knowledge is relevant and up to date. Education programs also provide the opportunity to debate in a non-threatening environment the challenges that MPs may be facing, and to put forward ideas to improve our political systems and processes, and in some instances to bring them into the 21st century. I'm going to close by a little bit of wondering here. I just do wonder if a model such as the Commonwealth Integrity Commission would ever have been proposed if there was compulsory education programs for MPs. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Colleen, for a really interesting presentation. I'm going to invite participants to put up their hands to ask questions, and whilst participants perhaps think about the questions they might want to ask Jonathan and Colleen, I might just give my own quick summary of what I think both presenters offered up today. Firstly, Jonathan talked about political donations and campaign reform generally. He acknowledged the pressures on parties to raise money as just a reality of modern politics. And he described some previous attempts in New South Wales to limit donations to coming from just individuals. He talked about reporting threshold and caps on donations, and he particularly looked at an opt-out public funding model. And he also, towards the end, talked about trends in the United States in financing and campaign reform. And then he outlined 6 principles for a funding model, being transparency, integrity, that it be comprehensive and policeable, that it obviously be lawful in light of some of the New South Wales experience and court challenges, and that, of course, that it be consistent across the Federation as much as possible, and that it be representative. And then Colleen spoke about the difference between authoritarian regimes and liberal democratic systems, and gave us that framework to then talk about the federal government's recently proposed anti-corruption model, being the CIC model. And Colleen, like many, expressed great concern at the model's shortcomings, and talked in particular about the structural issues, that there were 2 distinct divisions, one which did have significant powers that could be applied to certain law enforcement and regulatory agencies, but another division that had far less powers to be able to exercise in relation to elected officials and certain public sector officers, and concluded by concentrating on the issue of compulsory education of MPs in areas of integrity and accountability, which I must say was of great interest to me as a clerk, Colleen, and some of what you said resonated with us, I'm sure, in terms of the challenges we face in that space. So thank you to both presenters for those presentations. I'm not seeing hands coming up. If the technical support crew is seeing something I'm not, please let me know.
Yeah, we do have a question from Ken.
Okay.
Ken, I might let you ask your question.
Yep.
Okay, am I now unmuted? I think I am.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, Speaker O'Day, your questioner is a former speaker himself from Victoria, but congratulations on the leadership that you've shown on this issue. My question to you is, why has New South Wales been able to make these reforms, which of course have a major effect in relieving the pressures on parties to raise donations and for companies to be subject to that sort of soliciting? And I think in that context, it's worth remembering that any gift at all can create a favourable impression between the people involved. It can be something as simple as a pen. It doesn't have to be a $1,000 donation or a multi-million-dollar donation from the firm. So I think that that's a really important aspect of what I'm about to ask you about, which is particularly relating to caps on expenditure. And I'm interested to know what lessons can be learned by the states, and particularly the Commonwealth, which could lead to similar integrity reforms to those that have been achieved in New South Wales.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Yes, you're absolutely right. You know, anything can influence people. Kind word can influence people, but you've got to draw the line somewhere realistically. And I think probably, you know, if you're going to allow private donations, then $1,000 is a lot better than $14,000, $15,000 as a disclosable limit. As I've indicated, I'd rather provide an option where people you know, could opt out of receiving any private donations and thereby become eligible for extra public funding, which would effectively be a full public funding model. But Ken, in New South Wales, it was a bipartisan effort to reform to the extent that we have reformed. As I've said, I don't think it goes far enough, but I think we can be at least proud that in New South Wales, I believe it's probably the best system in Australia, albeit still inadequate. But what is needed is strong leadership from the top, and that has to be bipartisan in order to affect change. And I think we've seen that in a number of instances. Can I you know, just use that as perhaps a leverage into just commenting on Colleen's you know, delivery and paper. Firstly, to thank Colleen not only for her paper but also for her leadership and contribution over so many years. And I know she stayed on in the leadership role in the ASPG longer than she wanted to, or has stayed on longer than she wanted to, because she has such a culture of service and dedication. So thank you, Colleen. But can I just reiterate my support from quite a few years ago of a federal ICAC, whatever you want to call it. And it is a real pity that for whatever reasons, and I won't comment on specifics, particularly in the shadow of a federal election, but it is a real pity that we don't have a federal integrity body in place. Can I also say that in terms of continuing education, I agree with you. In New South Wales, we've tried to introduce, or we have introduced, a new personal and professional development program, which involves partnering with 3 external bodies, but also a range of internal measures, which substantially builds on what was fairly scant education programs in a parliamentary context, which is an anathema to me in the context of having come from a legal and business background where continuing education is par for the course. But it's amazing how many people do still resist it. And those who most need to undertake education are those that probably resist it most. Suffice to say that it's very difficult to make, and in my experience, very difficult to make anything mandatory for an elected politician. And the best way to do that is through the leadership, again, of political party leaders, those who should show, I believe, greater leadership in terms of implementing that sort of change. But coming back to the donations, Ken, Yeah, look, I'm not afraid to speak my mind, but unfortunately, politics sometimes does get in the way, and you do need leadership, which is shown at a senior level across the political spectrum to affect these sorts of changes.
Andrew, may I ask a question of Jonathan, please?
Please go ahead, Colleen.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed your paper, Jonathan. Thank you. And as always, you tackle issues that a lot of MPs seem a little reluctant to tackle. I guess there's two questions. How are you going to convince the public to fund election campaigns? I agree with what you're saying 100%, because I think it would take a lot of undue influence out of the whole electoral process. But how are we going to convince the general public to do it? And my second question is, I've been following quite closely Simon Holmes Court support for the now called the Teal candidates. And it seems to me the argument being put by the candidates themselves and very much by Mr. Holmes Court, especially when he was addressing the National Press Club, which was a very interesting presentation, was that, oh, the millions that he is giving come with absolutely no strings attached.
Sure.
Well, isn't that what everybody who gives a political donation says?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm worried about.
I would say, look, there may be less strings attached, less, in the sense that he doesn't have an overt commercial interest, perhaps at the moment. But you can't tell me that when he suggests, if they're elected, and he suggests that they should be doing certain things, that they're not going to listen to that. And that's fettering their political judgment and their discretion as an elected representative of the public, not of him. So whether it's true or not, the perception is very much there to be, the implication is that he will have influence over them, maybe less than some other donors, but I think it's no different in terms of whether it's real or perceived. There are significant dangers there. In terms of convincing the public to dedicate more public resources into election funding models, I mentioned briefly the concept of a citizen assembly or a citizen jury, because I think if you and for those who aren't aware, citizen juries involve a representative random selection of members of the public, grassroots members of the public, and a deliberative process whereby they seriously consider the issue at hand, not just in a superficial way, but through in-depth deliberation, discussion, and not only would the model be subject to that discussion, but also the principle of whether more public funding should go into such a model as a means of improving our democracy. And there are different sorts of costs, and I believe that if you tested such a model and the appetite for increased public funding, I believe that most people in public land would support that, given the benefits in terms of trust, transparency, and confidence in our system. But let's test it. Let's put it to the public.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I might just check with the technical support crew that, again, I'm not missing any other questions, but if not, I've actually got a question of my own to put. So can I just get Rachel to perhaps jump in?
Vaughan's got a question. Vaughan,
Yep.
do you want to
Great.
ask it live?
Yeah, sure. It was to Colleen, but perhaps also to Speaker O'Day. Colleen, you talked about the proposed CIC as an example where better adherence to liberal democratic principles would benefit. What is another, I guess, in the pantheon of things that members might improve through adhering to those principles better, what would you think is the next most important?
Probably political donations. I think that's something that needs to be dealt with. I wrote 5 or 6 years ago in quite a lengthy report I did on political donations. My opening line was, Australians have been let down by their members of parliament. And that was going across the board in all jurisdictions about political donations, although I think it was the Kerry shot in New South Wales had, I think, a lot of influence in making the system as good as it is today. The other thing, I mean, you know, let's go to something really simple. Truth in advertising, truth in political advertising. I simply do not understand how any parliament in a liberal democracy would say to everybody else, no, of course you must be truthful in advertising, but we can say whatever we like and we don't have to be truthful. And it's even the small things that don't come up all the time, only come up at election times. So I just see this sort of concern about not adhering to those principles. And I sincerely do wonder that if a lot of it could well be that candidates, when they become MPs, simply don't understand the system. And I do think that doing something about that system would help considerably. It's sure that I understand the role of parties, but, you know, there's some concerning issues with parties. I'd love to see an inquiry into the running of political parties, but of course we know that's never going to happen, don't we? But, you know, I think we need to keep on going back a step. I would like to also see if you're going to look at the democratic process of a representative government. I'm sorry, we need to go back one step and examine in some depth how people become candidates. And a lot of the time you'd be hard pressed to say that was a democratic process. Sometimes it's just simply the gift of the leader of a political party. And I'm talking about all political parties here. So, you know, there are so many, but yet fundamentally we still have one of the best systems in the world. I understand that, but I don't take it for granted. And if we don't do something to fix up some of the problems, we're going to wake up one day and find we don't have the system that we all thought we did. It happened in, perhaps one could argue anyhow, that it happened in the United States a couple of elections ago. We just need to be aware democracy can only function if we the people are concerned to protect it. You know, I feel like I'm giving a sermon here. I'll be quiet.
All right, look, thanks very much. I'm conscious of time. It's 1 minute to the next session. So, look, what I might do is, on behalf of everyone who's attended, thank both Jonathan and Colleen for 2 wonderful presentations. We could have, I think, sat and discussed them for the rest of the day. The session that follows this is session 8, Parliamentary Privilege and Procedure. So I might now formally close session 7 and thank both presenters for a job well done. Cheers. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.